Hello everyone! Today I am super excited because I'm finally going to be opening and trying out this absolutely massive set of jelly gouache. I have had this sitting in my studio for probably a couple of months now, and I just haven't had the time to actually sit down and film this video, but today is the day. This is a 56 color set of the jelly gouache. It's actually funny, I had been looking at the jelly gouache paints for possibly like a year at this point, and you know, the smaller sets that come in like the pink or green containers, they always like fascinated me. I mean, just the concept of jelly gouache was interesting to me, and then I never got one of those, but then they started coming out with larger sets, and when I first tried to order this one, it was completely out of stock and I could not find it anywhere for the life of me. And then randomly a couple of months ago, I was having to order something from US Amazon, and I figured, you know, why not check just so that I can save on the import fees, and they had one left in stock. So I figured that was a sign, let's get it, and clearly the rest is history. So let's open this baby up. It has, I mean, the entire thing barely can fit in the camera frame, but it has these 4 latches. I have kind of opened this. I haven't opened any of the colors, but I did gaze upon this. It has handles. This thing is like really, really heavy. So flip all the latches, pull it up, and this is what you're met with. And this is just happiness to me. So all of these are individual cups of jelly gouache. I'm just gonna pull one out so you can actually see this. So they are all completely sealed right now. They're in like these plastic containers. They're kind of like sauce dip containers almost, I guess you could say. And just, I know I looked at this before, they have no English names on them. So I am going to be making a swatch sheet, and I'm going to have to figure out how I'm going to sort of label these or whatever, but I'm assuming possibly this might be the color name, just because on these, that is the only bit of writing that's different. Because the number on them is the exact same, it's 8030. The barcodes are actually different on those two. Yeah, so the barcodes are different, but there is definitely no English name on these, so this might just be a complete like go by color sort of situation. I might actually number the cups later, but we will see. The first thing that I am going to do though is, this is just how the gouaches themselves came, and obviously I do need to open them all up, but before I do that, I'm actually going to completely recolor order these, because right now they're kind of all over the place. You know, you've got greens up here, greens down here, blues everywhere, yellows are all mix matched. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to completely reorganize the colors in this. I figured the easiest way to start reorganizing the color order of these gouache paints would be to pick out and group all of the colors within their color range. So grab all of the greens, grab all of the yellows, kind of grab the oranges, then the pinks, the blues, so on and so forth. There were a decent amount of colors that were on the more strange side. They didn't really fit into one particular group, so they were just kind of in between the middle of all of those. And as far as my reorganization went, I basically started at the upper left corner with more of the ivory Naples yellows type of colors, and then gradually worked my way through the yellows, then the oranges. There were these slightly strange peachy-ish fleshy tone colors that normally you might want to put in the more neutral range of things, like down by the black and grays, just definitely more in the brown ranges, but they definitely had a very strong orangey pink tint to them, and certain colors like that ended up being very useful in sort of a natural transition between color groups. So some of the more strange teal colors ended up being great to transition from the blues to the greens. But yeah, that was my whole kind of thought process behind my particular preference for this color organization, but ultimately organize this in whatever way you would find the most useful for your workflow. Here is what my reorganized color layout looks like. If anything's messed up, it's my own fault, but I'm pretty happy with the transition in the colors. It matches what I'm used to working with, so I figured this should work out well for me. But now it is time to actually start opening up all of these packets. Now, I had already seen at least one person on YouTube struggle with getting the tops off of these paints, so I was decently mentally prepared for this. But let me just tell you right now, I am not going to force you to sit through watching me open all of these paints because it went interestingly. It's actually kind of impressive just how different some of the lids were to attempt to remove, because some of them came off like clean off, 2 seconds flat, no problem. Other ones, it was just atrocious. So let this be your fair warning if you are planning on buying a jelly gouache set that involves packaging similar to this one. The packaging is possibly going to frustrate you, because I think I fared way better than some other people I've seen trying to open these on YouTube, and this particular color right here that I'm opening, this one, was the absolute worst. This was also the time that I found out just how pigmented these paints were, because there is still a bit of dye left on my fingers from trying to open all of these colors. Here is what all of the cups look like now that they are opened. That was like 40 minutes of my life trying to get all of the lids off of these, and some of them aren't perfect. There are like plastic pieces around the edges, and I definitely gave up with that one. These paints do definitely have a scent to them. It's nothing that bothers me though. It also is possibly the quantity of paint, because obviously these cups are very large on their own, and then there are 56 of them in my case. So considering both of those factors, that's possibly why I can smell the paint. It's nothing that bothers me. It actually reminds me of airbrushing. It's kind of like, it's mostly the scent of like the jar that you like spray your extra paint into, like a rubbery type of scent. But like I said, nothing that bothers me. It's just more noticeable for these particular paints than other paints of mine that I have used. But now that these are all de-lidded, I'm gonna draw up a swatch sheet and then start actually swatching these. I didn't do anything particularly fancy for this swatch chart. I just cut down a piece of pretty standard watercolor paper to an 8.5 by 11 size so that it could fit in a sheet protector, and just measured and divided it into 56 sections. I did decide to add a swatch of black watercolor ground to each of the individual swatch slots. This is something that I decided to do for another gouache sheet that I had just recently created, and seeing as gouache is supposed to be more of an opaque medium, just having the value difference between the white paper and the darker background, I think is just, it gives you a more accurate representation of how that paint might work if you are trying to paint over darker colors. And I just prefer to use watercolor ground because it mimics the texture of the watercolor paper the most. As for the paint swatches themselves, I started with a top sort of stripe of the jelly paint at full opacity, and then I added some water to my brush and kind of dragged down the color to thin it out so you could see just the undertones of the paint, as well as just seeing how opaque that color might be when thinned out with a bit more water. You know, basically just standard swatching practices. But for now, I'm going to stop talking so you can enjoy this nice, calming swatch fest. is the Jelly Gouache swatch sheet, and I just wanted to give you a bit of a comparison to a more traditional type of gouache paint. So here is the Arteza gouache that I recently swatched, and it has the same kind of idea where it has the black paint so you can see the difference between the two. And I'm not sure if you can see, but you probably can. I think that these jelly gouache paints, they don't dilute quite as smoothly as something that is more of a traditional gouache paint, because like I said, these are pretty much swatched in the same fashion. So you can see with the Arteza paints, it just seems like a bit more of a smooth transition when I start to pull the fully opaque color down with the water. But I don't necessarily think that's a terrible thing with these jelly gouache paints. It really depends on how you want to use them. For me, I am planning on using them at more of the opaque end of things and not so much diluting them in like the watercolor sense. So for me, that's not like a deal breaker, but depending on how you might like to use your gouache paints or how you might be hoping to use your gouache paints, that just might be something to consider, because these are somewhat around the same sort of price point and color range. The jelly gouache, these are the 56 color set, and the Arteza gouache is 60 colors, but you end up with 12 metallic. So technically less normal colors, but you do get 4 more paints in total. As far as the color selection goes, you can probably see the two do have very similar color schemes, I guess you could say. Like their color range is fairly similar, especially in some of these more strange colors, I guess you could say. Like this taupey kind of color is similar to that one. The tan is also kind of similar to a few of those. Just some of the more unique colors that you wouldn't necessarily see in like a typical watercolor paint range. They seem to be somewhat similar between the two. Like this ice blue color is not something you would normally see in like a watercolor paint. But the overall color range for the jelly gouache paints, I think is good. There's nothing in particular that I can really think of except maybe like a more burnt umbery type of color in this set that I would say is really missing. The only other thing is a super deep purple. You can see the purple ranges here. That is as dark as the purple goes in the jelly gouache, but if you look at something like the Arteza gouache, this violet color here is significantly deeper. This color is almost identical to the second deepest purple in the Arteza range, but overall I'm not like upset with the color range. If anything, I think there's almost a disproportionate amount of greens, and also these two colors, they look almost identical in the pans. They look almost identical swatched. I am like still 60% convinced possibly that they are the exact same color for some reason. So if you've bought this set, let me know if you ended up with these like 2 lime greens that are basically the same. Like when I swatch them, there is like minimal difference, just possibly in like the slightest bit of opacity, but like really not much, and I can barely tell a difference. So it would be nice to see definitely one of those being switched out with one of the colors that's possibly missing. But overall in the color range, you can just kind of see, like even in the blue areas, you have these 5 blues that fit in line with a sort of standard blue color scheme. And then you kind of have these more unique greeny blue colors, which I don't mind. But then you have pretty much almost these entire 2 rows, so almost like 15 colors there of green basically versus like the 5. Like these ones are in the more like strange tealy blue color, and I do think these colors here are interesting. I just think that there might be a slight disproportionate amount of green compared to some of the others. Especially if you look over at the Arteza gouache, you can see here you have really basically 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7-ish greens. These two are kind of like the in-between greeny blue colors, which is perfectly in line with the blue range. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So you're about on par with those. If you were looking at this for being like your go-to paint palette, you might have some of the issues like I was saying with like the missing dark purple and stuff, and possibly find the more unique colors not as useful, but as someone that does have a ton of art supplies, I can appreciate those more unique colors because it is setting things apart a little more. And especially for seeing this as this is gouache, those more unique, super white base heavy paints, those are the kind of colors that I would want to use in a gouache. Something else that I want to sort of show and mention is obviously the last time I showed you this lid and took it off, all of the paints were already sealed. And you can see now that they are open, it does create a bit of a mess, or just, you know, there is definitely some paint on this. Not a big deal, but you are going to want to make sure that you replace this lid onto your paints in the same orientation so that you don't have any sort of color mixing issues going on there. I'm not entirely sure how well this like a foam padding bit is going to keep the colors wet, we will say, as to avoid the other term that I might have used. I'm also not sure if you're supposed to wet this, but it just kind of seems like a mold magnet if I did wet it, not entirely sure. So right now it is dry and just sort of has this paint all over it. I also never got a chance to show you before that the back you can actually see all of the color pots in, which I'm not sure if you're going to be staring at the back this much, but it is definitely very visually appealing to look at this back. Slightly random, but I figured doing a close-up of the actual texture of the paint might be helpful for some people. It's almost like a toothpaste sort of consistency. It's definitely not like Jello like the name might suggest. It's just kind of more like a heavy-ish body sort of acrylic feel. The first test that I felt was almost the most important of the tests that I wanted to try out was rewettability. So I took small little daubs of a few different colors and just left them out on this palette to completely dry. Once those had dried, I swatched the exact same colors, but these were swatches of paint fresh out of the pots. Now moving back to the dried paints, you can see right away that the color is actually being able to be reactivated, which this property does fall in line with traditional gouache properties, that they can be reactivated once they've dried, which is awesome because if that whole lid situation doesn't work out great, it means that you're not going to end up with all of this wasted paint at the end if for some reason the cups dry out reasonably fast. It also means, in the case that I was using it kind of in here, that you can take slightly smaller quantities of the paint and put it out on a palette and not have to worry about that drying out in between you using it. And here is the comparison of the swatches between the fresh out of the pot colors and the reactivated ones. I feel like for the most part, the colors are almost on par, even with opacity. When I was swatching these paints, I was a little worried with how they were thinning out with water, or more accurately, how they weren't thinning out well with water. But I am definitely impressed how these reactivated colors look, but let's go and run some more tests. Next, I wanted to do a somewhat standard blend test, just seeing how well I could get these colors to blend out on their own as well as with each other, so just creating a fairly simple gradient up here. And these particular colors were fresh out of the pots if you're interested. Next, I did 3 patch swatches of color so that once they were dry, I could use them in a bit of an experiment to see how layering worked with this paint. Once those patches had dried, I started off by doing a test with the reactivated color first, and then I went in with it straight out of the pan, just to see the differences between the paint thickness. Obviously, when it's fresh out of the pot, you can get a much more thick coat, so I wanted to see if the underlying color would actually bleed through that. And I basically just repeated this experiment with the various colors and different swatches on top. Now while I was doing those swatch tests, I realized that my gradient that I did first dried a little unevenly, so I wanted to see if I could blend that in a little better by reactivating the paint that was already there just with some more water, and just seeing how much the paint itself could be reactivated and thinned out on the page. And here is what my test page looked like dry. Gouache does tend to dry a bit on the lighter side compared to something like watercolor. There is a little more noticeable difference in the color, which is also why doing swatches can be important. But overall, I do really like how this paint looks like dry. I think the reactivation swatches at the bottom are great looking, which is a great surprise because, like I mentioned before, I was a little worried as to how this paint would like being thinned down with a bit of water. The layering test is where you start seeing more of a difference between the fresh out of the pot colors and the reactivated ones. Because the reactivated paint is a bit more watery, it tends to make the underlying color bleed through and reactivate itself a lot more than just using it straight out of the pan in a thicker consistency. I am pleasantly surprised though that as far as I can tell, the color underneath did not change the thicker swatches of the paint at all. There was no kind of color changing or bleed through that sometimes happens when you put lighter colors over darker ones. So that's going to be a great help if you're doing more complicated and layering pieces. And as for the gradient swatch, you can see just how much the water layer over top and me just kind of blending it out did actually work and help. So this paint can definitely be blended out very easily once it is dried on the page and reactivated, which can be both a help and possibly a problem depending on your painting situation. But now that these tests are done, I think it's time to start actually using these for a painting. I did decide to go the route of applying a select number of colors onto a palette and just gradually working through them and, if need be, reactivating them with water. For my first true painting test with these, I decided to try and create a galaxy. I've created galaxies in just about every medium at this point. I'm very comfortable with painting them, and because I have used so many mediums for these, I feel like it gives me a good handle on the possible differences between this particular type of gouache versus another kind versus, watercolor and so on and so forth. A galaxy also gives me the opportunity to test out a few different things like blendability. You want your nebula colors to be fairly well blended, but galaxies tend to be a very depth-heavy type of artwork, so you also get to test out the possible depth range of some of your darker colors. It's especially important in gouache considering that the paint generally dries fairly lighter than when it's wet, so sometimes you can end up with a more of a chalky look than if you're using something like watercolor paint. So yeah, just overall, a galaxy I feel like is a decently comprehensive test for trying out a new paint medium, at least in my case. For all of the swatches and the paintings, etc., I'm using a synthetic brush, and a synthetic brush that is a bit on the more stiff side. If you're interested, it is a Royal & Langnickel soft grip brush in various sizes. But what I noticed when I was doing this painting, and especially also when I was doing the swatches, is the jelly paint really likes staying in the bristles. Now for my water container, I actually use what is actually marketed and considered a brush cleaner. It has a kind of comb in the bottom, and it's just my preference to use. You can basically rake your brushes through it and it just cleans them out a bit easier. And I found that even doing that with this brush type and this paint, it still left sometimes a decent amount of paint within the bristles, which I can only assume has to do with the consistency of the paint itself. And I use a brush cleaner container like this for even when I'm using acrylic paint for some of my prop painting, and I never have this problem of the paint staying in the bristles of a brush to the extent that I found with this particular type of paint. My solution was just to have a shop towel kind of beside my water container so that I could wipe off the brush to just clean it a bit further. So it's not a deal breaker, it's just an observation that I wanted to mention that might just be an added consideration or just an added step in your workflow when using these paints. Now I know in my little ramble on about the paint sticking in the brush, we did switch paintings that I was working on, but the Galaxy I feel like went really smoothly, and I really wanted to try a type of painting that involved a lot more layering, because the Galaxy I basically did in one layer and just added stars after, which was awesome. I will show you what that looks like after this and like show you all of the paintings once they've completely dried, just so you can get a full feel of the medium and what it looks like once it has dried. But I wanted to do a smaller eye study that I could attempt to mimic a more typical situation in which I would find myself using these paints. So generally possibly starting off with more of a lighter watercolor like gouache and gradually building up the colors. For this study, I wanted to keep things pretty loose and really work with the benefit of the gouache being a more opaque medium and just having that overall more brush stroke and painterly look. And you might be thinking the colors are looking a little strange, and I would agree with you. I was actually trying to only use the paints that I had previously pulled out on my palette, with the exception of this brown that I just added as the upper lash line. But I wanted to also see how these paints mixed, which overall I think they mix great. I didn't find any particular issues of them blending together and creating a cohesive color, so that's an awesome benefit to these paints as well. Overall, I had a lot of fun with this study. If anything, it's just me being out of practice with gouache paint, and just their overall properties possibly made this particular painting go a little less smoothly than it could have had I had a little more practice before this. Now I know up until this point in the video I have kept everything as sort of a fact-based and just observations that I've had with the paint, but what do I actually think of this jelly gouache? And do I think it is a valid option for artists to use? And my answer to that is yeah, I had a lot of fun with this paint. It doesn't have a lot of downsides to it. If anything, I think the biggest thing that sort of comes to mind is that I would assume that there's probably absolutely no light fastness grading to be found in this paint. It is much more synthetic sort of based paint, but I know for a lot of people that is not a deal breaker. It's again just sort of up to personal preference. I think that this paint can be great for beginner artists if, you're wanting to try out a gouache paint or something along those lines. The only possible downside that I could see is because this is a more unique type of gouache paint, if you're going from something like this to, say, down the line you want to purchase a more professional type of gouache paint, the consistency differences could possibly throw you for a loop, although overall the paint itself reacts pretty similarly, in my opinion, to more standard types of gouache paint. This paint also has the added bonus of coming in such large quantities. Even if you weren't buying this whole 56 paint set, just the individual colors themselves, the just quantity of them is massive. So if you were a beginner, you don't have that fear of possibly using up an excessive amount of paint and just blowing through it super fast. And it also has the benefit of, because it is a more inexpensive type of paint that you do get a large quantity of, if you are an artist that is doing a type of artwork that uses a much higher quantity of paint, then that's also going to be an added bonus for you. So personally, I really like this gouache paint. I don't think for a lot of people that this jelly gouache type of paint is going to all of a sudden replace their, say, professional paint colors or their personal favorites. I just think overall it's a great contender in the gouache world, and if you have been interested in trying out one of these jelly gouache type of paints, then I think it would be worthwhile. I don't think you're going to be disappointed. I also really like the idea idea of it being a more inexpensive paint that I do have larger quantities of, so I don't feel, say, guilty using it in maybe more of an experimental or sketchbook type of setting. I feel like a lot of artists have that if it's not like a super serious piece of artwork that you possibly want to use a particular medium for, you might feel guilty with using your more expensive professional paints for that piece. So yeah, overall, I really like this paint. I can't wait to play around with it even more. Do you own one of these Jelly Gouache paint sets? Do you like it, or do you have some issues with it? I would love to know. But that is where I'm going to end this review video. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video.